Hello and welcome to the Street Crime America's YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe. Today we look at the life of a notorious American criminal who will never be forgotten about in the American criminal underworld. John Donato Torrio, born Donato Torrio, was born on January the 20th, 1882 and was an Italian-American mobster who helped build the Chicago outfit in the 1920s. It was later inherited by Mr. Donato's protege, Al Capone. Mr. Torrio proposed a national crime syndicate in the 1930s and later became an advisor to Lucky Luciano and his Luciano crime family. Mr. Torrio had several nicknames, primarily the Fox for his cunning and finesse. Considered one of the most influential personalities in American organized crime, Mr. Torrio impressed the authorities and chroniclers with his business acumen and diplomatic skills. The US Treasury official Elmer Eyre considered Mr. Torrio the biggest gangster in America and wrote that he was the smartest and I dare say the best of all the hoodlums. Virgil W. Peterson of the Chicago Crime Commission stated that his talents as an organizational genius were widely respected by the major gang bosses in the New York City area. Crime journalist Herbert Asbury affirmed that as an organizer and administrator of underworld affairs, Johnny Torrio is unsurpassed in the annals of American crime. Mr. Torrio was born in Ersina, then known as Montepeloso, Basilicata in southern Italy, to Tommaso Torrio and Maria Carluccio, originally from Atamura, Apulia. When Mr. Torrio was 2, Mr. Torrio's father, a railway employee, died in a work accident. Shortly after, Mr. Torrio immigrated to James Street on the Lower East Side of New York City with his widowed mother in December 1884. Mr. Torrio's first jobs were as a porter and bouncer in Manhattan. While Mr. Torrio was a teenager, he joined a street gang together with fellow James Street resident Robert Vanilla and became its leader. Mr. Torrio eventually managed to save enough money and opened a billiards parlour for the group, and from there grew illegal activities such as gambling and loan sharking. Mr. Torrio's business sense caught the eye of Paul Kelly, the leader of the infamous 5 Points gang. Mr. Torrio's gang ran legitimate businesses, but its main concern was the numbers game, supplemented by incomes from bookmaking, loan sharking, hijacking, prostitution and opium trafficking. Al Capone, who worked at Kelly's club, admired Mr. Torrio's quick mind and looked to him as his mentor. Mr. Capone had belonged to the Junior 40 Thieves, the Bowery Boys and the Brooklyn Rippers. They soon moved up to the 5 Points gang. Mr. Torrio eventually hired Mr. Capone to bartend at the Harvard Inn, a bar in the Coney Island section of Brooklyn, owned by Mr. Torrio's business associate Frankie Yale. Mr. Torrio was the nephew of Victoria Moresco and the wife and business partner of Big Jim Colosimo, who had become the owner of more than 100 brothels in Chicago. According to Lawrence Bergreen, Mr. Torrio is also described as Mr. Colosimo's nephew, but in the absence of any evidence to confirm the relationship, it's more likely their kinship was spiritual rather than familial. In 1909, Mr. Colosimo invited Mr. Torrio to Chicago to deal with extortion demands from the Black Hand. Mr. Torrio eliminated the extortionists and stayed on. Mr. Torrio ran Mr. Colosimo's operation and organized the criminal muscle needed to deal with the threats to them. In 1919, Mr. Capone also left New York for Chicago at the invitation of Mr. Torrio. Mr. Capone began in Chicago as a bouncer in a brothel. When Prohibition went into effect in 1920, Mr. Torrio pushed for the gang to enter bootlegging, but Mr. Colosimo stubbornly refused. In March 1920, Mr. Colosimo secured an uncontested divorce from Miss Moresco. A month later, Mr. Colosimo and Dale Winter eloped to the West Baden Springs, Indiana. Upon their return, they brought a home on the south side. On May the 11th, 1920, Mr. Torrio called and told Mr. Colosimo that a shipment was about to arrive at his restaurant. Mr. Colosimo drove there to await it, but instead, Mr. Colosimo was shot in an ambush and killed. Frankie Yale had allegedly travelled from New York to Chicago and personally killed longtime gang boss Mr. Colosimo at the behest of Chicago outfit friends Mr. Torrio and Mr. Capone. Although suspected by Chicago police, Mr. Yale was never officially charged. Mr. Colosimo was allegedly murdered because he stood in the way of his gang making bootlegging profits, having gone soft after his marriage with Winter. Al Capone has also been suggested as the gunman. Mr. Colosimo's ex-wife, unhappy with the financial arrangements of the divorce, is also theorised to have arranged the murder. Mr. Torrio was wary of being drawn into gang wars and tried to negotiate agreements over territory between rival crime groups. The smaller Northside gang led by Dean O'Banion, was also known as Dion O'Banion, was of mixed ethnicity, and it came under pressure from the Jenner brothers, who were allied with Mr. Torrio. Mr. O'Banion found that Mr. Torrio was unhelpful with the encroachment of the Jenner brothers into the North Side, despite his pretensions to be a settler of disputes. This placed Jaime Weiss at the head of the gang, backed by Vincent Drucci and Bugs Moran. Mr. Weiss had been a close friend of Mr. O'Banion, and the Northsiders made it a priority to get revenge on his killers. Assassination attempts and handover to Capone in January 1925. Mr. Capone was ambushed, leaving Mr. Capone shaken but unhurt. 12 days later, on January 24th, Mr. Torrio was returning from a shopping trip with his wife Anna when Mr. Torrio was shot several times. After recovering, Mr. Torrio effectively resigned and handed control to Al Capone, aged 26, who became the new boss of an organisation that took in illegal breweries and transportation networks that reached Canada with political and law enforcement protection. In turn, Mr. Capone was able to use more violence to increase revenue. An establishment that refused to purchase liquor from Mr. Capone often got blown up, and as many as 100 people were killed in such bombings during the 1920s. In late 1925, Mr. Torrio moved to Italy, where he no longer dealt directly in mob business with his wife and mother. Mr. Torrio gave total control of the outfit to Mr. Capone and said, "It's all yours, Al. Me, I'm quitting. It's Europe for me." Mr. Torrio left a criminal empire which grossed about $70 million a year, just under $1 billion value in 2018, from bootleg booze, gambling and prostitution. In 1928, Mr. Torrio returned to the United States as Benito Mussolini and began putting pressure on the mafia in Italy. Mr. Torrio is credited with helping to organise a loose cartel of East Coast bootleggers, the Big Seven, in which a number of prominent gangsters, including Lucky Luciano, Longy Zwolman, Joe Adonis, and Frank Costello, along with Meyer Langsy, played a part. Mr. Torrio also supported the creation of a national body that would prevent the sort of all-out turf wars between gangs that had broken out in Chicago and New York. Mr. Torrio's idea was well received, and a conference was hosted in Atlantic City by Mr. Torrio, Langsy Luciano, and Mr. Costello in May 1929. Mr. Torrio was charged with income tax evasion in 1936, and after several failed appeals was sent to prison in 1939, serving 2 years. In 1940, property that Mr. Torrio co-owned with Vanilla, Jack Cusick and Al Capone was sold at auction to satisfy Capone's tax delinquencies. After Mr. Torrio was released, he lived quietly until his death. On April the 16th, 1957, Mr. Torrio had a heart attack in Brooklyn while he was sitting in a barber's chair waiting for a haircut. Mr. Torrio died several hours later in a nearby hospital. The media did not learn about his death until 3 weeks after Mr. Torrio's burial. So what are your thoughts on the crimes committed by Johnny Torrio? Please let us know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, stay safe.